Good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. This is another episode of Vedic Inquirer, talking with Daksina, who's a member of the CPO from UK. And there's a lot of questions that have been raised about the CPO. Do we really need one? Is it truly independent? And does it actually work in a way that's fair and follow due process and so on? Daksina, thank you very much for joining us. Maybe you could say a few words about who you are and what brings you to the work that you do.
Hare Krishna, thank you so much for having me. My name is Daksina Devi Basia, and I am the current Child Protection Officer for Bhaktivedanta Mana, as well as the Regional Director for the UK. And I've been doing this service for about 11 years now. And I also help out in the international office, serving as sometimes as a case manager, sometimes as a review panel member, and also assist with training.
Great, thank you. So do we really need a CPO? Can't it just be looked into by external authorities, or can't it just be looked into by the temple president or the GBC?
I think if people kind of understood what it is that the Child Protection Office actually does, people would realize that, yes, we do have, statutory authorities to deal with, child protection issues, and our policy is that everything should be reported to the police. But unfortunately, they are also underpaid, overworked. They have lack of resources, and often when we take cases to them, they're not able to deal with them for a variety of reasons. So sometimes it's about in different countries, they have statute of limitations. So you have a limited time in which to report abuse, and if you, like right now, we've got a case in Europe where that limitation has been reached, so this person has no legal recourse to pursue this in the courts, but an allegation has been made. We don't know whether this devotee, the alleged offender, is a risk or not. So what do we do with this? We can't just ignore that. So that's what's, one thing that would be dealt with internally by the CPO. Also, sometimes you have the alleged offender in one country, the victim in another country, and the offence happened in a completely different country. So, which police force is going to deal with that? And as an international organisation, we have a central database with a list of, alleged offenders. We have regional directors that communicate with each other, so we can actually process the case internally. We're not trying to replicate, the legal sort of judicial system. It's just our own internal review system. But yeah, we can do that. Sometimes for legal cases, it doesn't even meet the threshold. The threshold for legal cases is greater than it is within our own internal system, which is, is it more likely than not that offence took place? Sometimes, cases do actually go through criminal courts, and then you have a convicted child sex offender who's served their time but is now out of prison and wants to be reintegrated back into our temples, our society. So without the CPO, who's going to monitor that? Who's going to see, what access he has to children, what access he has to youth groups? Also, sometimes victims don't necessarily want to pursue a legal course. We have that in the UK quite a lot, where part of my job as the Child Protection Officer for the Manor is to encourage devotees and to help them report, sometimes literally holding their hand at the police station while they file a report. But sometimes they just don't want to. And so again, what do we do with this person whom a very serious allegation has been made against them, but because the victim won't report to the police won't do anything about it? We still have a duty of care to protect other children if this person is indeed a risk to other children. So that, as well as, education and training for children, brahmacharis, parents, leaders, managers, that's all part of what the CPO does. So we're not trying to replace and replicate the judicial, external judicial system, but we do have our own internal system, because these are issues, like I've just listed, that are not going to be dealt with by the police or social services.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it sounds like you're very much on the victim side. If a victim reports and says, this is what's happened to me, as you say, you'll encourage them to go to the police, or if they're not willing to do that, it does sound like you're very much on the side of the person reporting the abuse. So what protections, I guess, are there for someone who might be innocently accused, or even just trying to defend themselves anyway?
I think, you know, if an allegation is brought to our attention and somebody says, you know, I've been abused or I've been harmed in a certain way, it's not that we are now just accepting that as fact, but our policy dictates that, you know, we do encourage them to report to statutory authorities. And if it's, you know, not dealt with by them for whatever reason, then we do have a fair and impartial process in place that does ensure that, you know, it's not just that we are blindly like, that's it, an allegation's been made, this person against this person, now they're banned for life, no contact with ISKCON ever again. You know, the process of the, you know, a case coming to the CPO is that both people are allowed to give, you know, submit statements, they're allowed to submit character references, they can submit psychological risk evaluations, you know, whatever information they want to submit. And they both have two opportunities to look at each other's evidence and respond. So it's done in like a sequential manner. And then all of that information is gathered and given to 3 devotees. We call them like review panel members, and they are not connected to the victims or the alleged offender in any way. And they, you know, we actually give the names to the alleged offenders and victims to say, these are the 3 possible devotees that will be looking at your case. Do you have any relationship to them? Do you have any objections to them? And also the same with the review panel members. They, you know, they recuse themselves if there's any connection. Generally, they're in a different country. So if, you know, if the alleged offence happened in the UK, we might have review panel members, one from Canada, one from North America, and one from a different country. Like, so we do try and keep them so that the time zones don't cause too much of a delay in meeting and talking, but they don't know anybody. And then they do look at the evidence, and, you know, these devotees are not, you know, they actually have more training than jurors do. Like, I was actually looking up, you know, what kind of training does the, you know, people who serve as jury members receive. And you have to be over 18 and you have to be of like sound mental health. And there's actually a whole push right now, at least in the UK, to get more training for jurors, because they come without really any kind of qualifications or trainings. And they might be given some guidance from the judge on, you know, like what to expect or how to kind of look at evidence. But our review panel members are, you know, they go through a 3-day child protection training course. And then they go through like 1.5 to 2 days of specifically review panel training. So that is, you know, looking at evidence, deciding, you know, the weight of the evidence. And also after that, they are encouraged to do continued professional development courses outside of ISKCON. And at the moment, I would say in the last few years that I've been a case manager and worked with, you know, review panel members, they are all professionals in the outside world as well. You know, you're talking about like lawyers, magistrates, we've got counsellors, teachers, we have child protection, you know, specialists, we have a domestic violence charity worker. So these are people who work in that field, have experience, have specialties in that field. And then also they have the internal training as well. So they do look at it objectively. Yeah.
In terms of that initial gathering of data, that's an assigned caseworker that would do that. They would interview the victim, the survivor, and then the same person would go and interview the accused? Or is it?
Generally, if there's a child protection team, it might be, you know, if there's a team, there's a few of you, you might kind of delegate different roles to different people. But otherwise, if the director appoints like a case manager, then it would be the case manager that's responsible for collecting, you know, all the materials and sending it back and forth between the two parties.
Is there ever some mix-up between the legal process and the CPO process, meaning that one sort of interferes or is perceived to take precedence over the other in some ways?
So whenever a case comes to us, you know, our policy dictates that we report it to statutory authorities. And if they sort of, you know, pick up the investigation, then the CPO investigation is on pause. Like, we don't do our own investigation. Right. We will wait and see the outcome, because the point of the review process is to see, is it likely, more likely than not, that this person has committed this act of abuse. But if the judicial system has already done that for us and given us a guilty verdict, then we don't need to go through that. There are already like automatic restrictions on a person who is found guilty, you know, in legal court. If it goes through the court system and it comes back as not guilty, we then do still have our own internal process. Like in the UK, at least, we work very closely with an external child protection agency, and we have done, I think they've been on board since before even I joined the child protection team, and everything, you know, goes through them. So we will go to them and say, this case has come up, the courts have said he's not guilty, or there's not enough evidence, what do we do with this person now? So they're not lawyers, but because they are experts in their fields, we're legally covered by their guidance and their recommendations. So they will come back and say, well, actually, let's do a risk assessment for this person and see, you know, do they pose a risk? Just because somebody has been found not guilty doesn't necessarily mean they haven't committed the crime. It might just mean, you know, sometimes it's thrown out on technical errors. So yeah, we work with like a specialist child protection agency. And I think this really should be sort of the structure everywhere in ISKCON, that you are working with independent external child protection specialists, and then their recommendations, you know, they cover you legally, but they're also going to be completely independent, because they are not connected to anybody in ISKCON. They don't know the victim, they don't know the alleged offender.
It would seem that the CPO restrictions, let's say that someone is found to be more likely than not have offended, would basically be restrictions about visiting an ISKCON premise or something. I mean, it obviously can't go too much further than that. It's simply
exactly. Yeah, you're basically just saying what access they can have, and as a private organization, we have a right to that. You know, we have a right of access, but also, you know, we're not looking just at, has this person broken the law? That's for, you know, legal authorities to look at. But in terms of our organization, we have an internal process, like, you know, most companies do. They have internal reviews. Has this person violated our own policies? Have they violated our own values and our own spiritual practices? Because the law is like the basic minimum standard. You know, as aspiring devotees, we do have a higher standard of behavior that's expected, you know, higher behavior and higher conduct that's expected from our members. So yeah, there's, whilst we're not trying to replicate, you know, I know people think, oh, you know, there's no prosecution lawyers, there's no defense lawyers, because we're not trying to replicate that system. This is just our own internal investigation to look at whether our policies have been violated, and we have the prerogative to do that as a private organization.
Do you find that there's ever pushback from ISKCON authorities? Perhaps the person who's been accused and found to be likely to have committed an offence is well liked, where they either resist on implementing the sanctions, or they even try to advocate on the guilty party's behalf?
Yes, unfortunately, we do.
So what does CPO do in that kind of instance?
We just push through, and we just fight back. You know, I think there are definitely in the past been people in this service who might have kind of given in or kind of, I don't know what the word is, but definitely the directors that are, like Kamlesh Krishna Prabhu, the director, and Ganavika, the assistant director at the moment, they don't sort of take, at the end of the day, the GBC they've created the CPO office. They've given the CPO the jurisdiction to deal with child protection cases. So we are the people that are trained and qualified and been nominated to deal with these things. So yes, you might not be happy that your spiritual master or your friend or your, sister or whatever is been found to have committed an act of abuse and therefore has restrictions on them. But ultimately, temple presidents, GBCs do have a responsibility to follow their own laws, their own child protection policy that says they have to comply. It is frustrating because I would say a lot of our time is actually spent emailing and having conversations with people, trying to justify the decision or trying to explain, what the process is. And I think part of it is that our leaders don't get any mandatory child protection training. At the GBC meetings, why are we not having child protection training every 2 or 3 years? Because I don't know if you've heard of ISKCON. So in the UK recently, the government appointed this independent inquiry into child sexual abuse in institutions. So their main focus was sort of religious organizations like the Catholic Church, but they actually contacted us as well and said, as Hare Krishnas, a Hindu faith in the UK, what are your child protection policies? What are your practices? Because of the pandemic, that's kind of been put on pause at the moment, but they are going to come back to us and look at how we deal with cases. But it's interesting because I'll just read this to you. They release like interim reports that I think the full report comes out next year. And in that report, they were looking at, so it's not just religious organizations, they also look at like, scouts and schools and other secular institutions. And they said that there are major gaps in the practical knowledge of even senior people about basic safeguarding principles. The quality of leadership is crucial to protecting children and preventing child sexual abuse. It is a matter of grave concern that even after significant public outcry about allegations of child sexual abuse, leaders do not understand how to respond to allegations properly, and they make poor judgments when they do respond.
This was about ISKCON in particular?
No. This is about all other
society. Yeah.
Yes, religious organizations and secular. So the issues and challenges that we have in child protection are not unique to us. Ineffective leadership, as they call it, is a challenge across institutions and organizations. But really, until we start embedding, until child protection is really embedded in our values and principles, not just that we have a policy and we quote Prabhupada, that's, when he says, oh, these children are from Vaikuntha, but until we actually believe that and we value children and we respect them and we want to protect them, then we're going to continue having the same issues, and then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that the CPO is dependent on the GBC for funding. It doesn't matter that leaders interfere. It doesn't matter that the CPO is dependent on the GBC for compliance, because if everybody's on the same page and everybody has embedded child protection as a value in our institution, then it doesn't matter where the funding is coming from.
I think I mentioned to Hridayananda Maharaj the other day that there had been some oversight of the CPO's processes. They'd been looked at by, a particular senior person in the know, and were given a sort of royal stamp of approval. Is that correct? Is this the ISKCON body or whatever that you were talking about?
So we haven't actually heard back from ISKCON other than that they've confirmed that we will be part of their investigation, even though I have sent everything to them. But, we do have, like I said, the child protection specialists that we work with. They've looked at our policy and they think it's pretty robust and we've covered all aspects of it. They think our procedures are, actually very, very fair and tight. Like there's a very clear process of how cases are dealt with. There's a clear appeals process. So I'm not sure if that's the same person.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. Mine was hearsay, so I thought I'd just check with you. There are people who argue that the fact that the CPO is appointed, the CPO directors are appointed by the GBC, part funded by the GBC, and as we've seen in recent cases, occasionally the GBC may say, we're withholding this case, that somehow raises questions of either the effectiveness of the CPO or its true independence or whatever. What are your thoughts on this?
Like I said, in terms of the funding, I don't know what the solution is, because where else is the funding going to come from, you know? And even if it comes, let's say, from just members of our society, you'll have the same issue when a high profile case comes up. Disciples or well-wishers or peers will say, well, you know what, we're not going to give you funding anymore. So we're back in the same position. And actually, even if we were fully independently funded, let's say somebody gave a huge anonymous donation, no strings attached, because we are dependent on the cooperation of TPs and GBCs for compliance, we're still dependent on them, because ultimately the GBC are the ultimate governing body, and the CPO only has as much power as, you know, they give us. Like, even I was saying, we work with, you know, this external child protection agency. They can only give us recommendations, you know. Generally in the UK, I've not come across an issue where they've said we're not going to take that on board, but they could just say, well, we're paying this person for advice and recommendations. We're not under any obligation to implement it, because there's no external body that can enforce these decisions. So even with ISKCON, even this independent inquiry, even they can only make recommendations. So honestly, I don't know what the solution is, because we are working under the GBC. We try to be as so that they don't have any influence as much as possible. But, you know, like you said, when they decide we're taking this case off you, then the CPO doesn't have any jurisdiction. They can fight and argue and try to, you know, reason with them that, look, this is your own policy that says the CPO, you know, all cases should be dealt with by the Child Protection Office. But other than that, I don't know what the answer to that is.
Just to try and stick to a general principle here, obviously there is a case in mind, but trying to look at the broad principle. In instances where a case will not die, it came up 30 years ago, it's come back several times, it's been withheld from the CPO. Can you see any good coming out of the GBC sort of circumventing the CPO withholding?
Not really. I think you know, the case wasn't dealt with by the CPO at the time, and that's why it's come up again, you know. And people are saying, oh, you know, it might be a double jeopardy, but that's not applicable, because our office never processed this case, and even at the moment it's not processing it. And I think actually it's a disservice to everybody involved, even the alleged offender, because if the GBC decide to deal with it themselves, this is not going to go away, you know. It might die down for a while, but it will come up again, because it's not going through the proper process. And it's not that we don't have cases that go through our office that also don't, you know, have sort of strong opposing reactions and views, but after a while they do sort of just die down, you know. I've worked on several high profile cases where at the time, you know, I was getting like threats on Facebook. I was being told, don't come to Mayapur, you're going to have like acid thrown in your face. You know, we've like lost friends over it. But it does sort of just, you know, especially when the alleged offender realizes that, okay, there's no way back for me unless I follow the restrictions and do the required things in order to reestablish my relationship with ISKCON again. And they generally do always comply, you know, and then it dies down. But when it's not dealt with properly, it is going to keep coming up again, and it's unfair for everybody involved, you know, not just the victim or the advocates for the victim.
How do you maintain resolve yourself when you get these kind of nasty threats? Because it does sound like they're particularly, you know, scary things.
luckily I have like a very supportive, team around me, very supportive husband, and I'm just not on Facebook.
Right, that's probably the answer to most issues.
Facebook, yeah. And the thing is that, it is a really hard service, and actually the devotees who are, on the ground doing this service day in, day out are very sincere and trying to make a difference. And people can say the CPO is useless, they don't make any difference, but I can see locally, nationally, internationally, people who, we would be deemed a risk to children no longer have access to children. They cannot go to Mayapur and become a Gurukul teacher. They cannot come to the UK and open, a youth center if, within ISKCON, if temples are doing screening, if they are going through the CPO office and carrying out screening checks, we can actually make a change. I kind of, for me, it's like a traffic light system. Having traffic lights is not going to prevent all accidents and collisions, right? You'll still get, road traffic incidents, and you'll always get those people who kind of jump a red light. But imagine the chaos and the number of incidents that would occur if we just didn't have traffic light systems, So child protection is very much like that obviously there's always more to be done, and child protection evolves, and the needs and requirements change. Social media is changing, so we've got to always be updating our training and policies. But without it, there would be so many people who have access to children that would harm them. So I think just knowing that actually we are making a difference, even if it's just in our little area of influence, that is enough. There's a handful of people who should never be around children, and luckily in ISKCON they don't have access to children, and that for me, it's okay if people get angry about that and want to threaten me. For me, it's just part of, I can sleep easy at night knowing that we are actually making a difference.
Well, look, a massive thank you for what you do. A massive thank you for coming and explaining it all to us. Were there any other areas that we haven't touched on? Because I know you did quite a bit of prep for this. Were there any other areas you were ready to talk about?
No, I think we kind of covered everything. I think my main thing was just to say that, a lot of, because like I said, I'm not on Facebook. I do have a Facebook account just because I homeschool my children, so for their activities and things. And I did recently join the Vedic Inquirer page. And just from kind of having a look around on there to see, what kind of concerns people have about Child Protection Office, a lot of it is because people don't really know what we do. People make comments like they're just totally untrained and totally unqualified, or, they just don't have, they just don't do any, they've got no influence, or they're not making any difference. But you can go through our policies, you can speak to your local child protection teams. So you can basically educate yourself, and you'll find out that actually a lot of the criticisms that you have are not true. Particularly, like I said, about the training, we definitely have trained, mature devotees who do this service in as fair a way as possible. Like right. The directors, like they've both got the director, assistant director. Gandharvika, I think she's been doing child protection for excuse me, which I don't know that there's anybody who's been doing it longer than her.
Yeah, 22, 23 years or something from a little bit of research that I did.
Yeah.
Daksina, thank you very much. Much appreciated. I hope you'll be able to join us on the threads. Hopefully there'll be a few extra questions and so on when we upload the video. But thank you so much for making your time available tonight. Sure. And speaking to us.